Hello, everyone, and welcome to Midnight Whispers. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin. When I was growing up, my family had a distant but intriguing connection to a place that always felt slightly removed from ordinary life. My aunt had married into a relatively well-off English family, the kind that seemed quietly established rather than flashy. Her husband's family had purchased part of a large old mansion near Myler in Cornwall, a rural coastal area in the south of England, where the land slopes gently toward the sea and the air always smells faintly of salt. Because of that marriage, my parents, siblings, and I were occasionally invited to spend a few nights there during the summer holidays. As a child, and even as a teenager, it felt like a small adventure every time we went. The house itself was striking in a subdued, old-world way. It was built into the side of a hill and faced directly out toward the water. So many of the windows looked straight onto the sea. On clear days, the horizon stretched endlessly, and at night, the sound of waves carried up the slope, soft but constant. The building had once been a guest house, and although parts of it had been renovated, there was still a sense that it belonged to another era. Long corridors, thick walls, slightly uneven floors, and a staircase that creaked even when no one was on it, all contributed to the atmosphere. Locals in the area had always described the house as haunted, though as a child I never took that very seriously. To me, it sounded like the kind of thing people said about any old building that had been standing for a long time. At the time, I didn't know the real reason why the house had that reputation. I only learned the full story later. I did hear bits and pieces, though. I usually mentioned casually, during conversations at dinner or over tea. During some renovation work, for example, builders had reportedly claimed to see the ghost of a woman wearing an old-fashioned dress walking slowly down the stairs. They spoke about it matter-of-factly, as if they were describing an unusual but not entirely shocking inconvenience of working in such an old place. I remember listening to those stories with mild curiosity, but no real fear. I had never experienced anything strange myself, and as far as I was concerned, ghost stories were something that happened to other people. That changed one summer when I was older, and brought my girlfriend at the time with me to the house. She had never been to Cornwall before, and I was looking forward to showing her the coastline and the quiet beauty of the area. We were given a bedroom on the ground floor of the house. It was a comfortable room, simply furnished with a large bed and a window that looked out toward the garden. The only inconvenience was that it wasn't an ensuite. If you needed the toilet during the night, you had to leave the room, walk out into the hallway, and cross over to a bathroom directly opposite the door. The first couple of nights passed without incident. We spent our days exploring the area, walking along the coast and enjoying the slower pace of life. At night, the house was quiet, and apart from the occasional sound of the wind or the sea, there was nothing to disturb our sleep. I had all but forgotten the stories about the place being haunted. Then, in the middle of the night on one of those summer evenings, everything changed. I was asleep when my girlfriend gently shook me awake. She whispered that she needed to use the toilet and would be back in a moment. I sat up slightly, still half asleep, and mumbled something like okay before lying back down again. The room was dark, and neither of us turned on any lights. Even so, my eyes had adjusted enough that I could make out her silhouette as she opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and quietly closed the door behind her. I lay there, drifting back toward sleep. I remember feeling relaxed and unconcerned, expecting her to return any second. After what felt like about a minute, I heard the door open again. I heard footsteps crossing the room. Assuming it was my girlfriend coming back, I didn't bother opening my eyes. I shifted slightly to one side of the bed to make space for her. I felt the mattress dip as someone climbed in beside me. When I reached out, my hand touched what felt like the body of a woman. The sensation was completely normal, familiar even, and there was nothing at that moment that made me think anything was wrong. Then, without warning, I heard a woman's voice speaking from across from me. It wasn't my girlfriend's voice. It sounded close, but not right next to me, and it had a tone that felt oddly calm and conversational. She asked, "Are you going to come tomorrow?" The question instantly snapped me out of my half-asleep state. A wave of confusion and fear rushed through me all at once. Realizing that the voice did not belong to my girlfriend, I opened my eyes in shock. At that exact moment, the bedroom door opened again, and my girlfriend stepped into the room from the hallway. I looked from her to the bed beside me, my heart pounding. There was no one there. The space next to me was empty. The indentation in the mattress was gone, and the room felt suddenly colder, heavier, as if the air itself had changed. I sat bolt upright, completely panicked. My girlfriend immediately noticed something was wrong and rushed over, asking what had happened. For the next hour, she sat with me, trying to calm me down while I explained everything in a rush, my words tumbling over each other. I told her about hearing the door, feeling someone get into bed, touching a body, and then hearing a strange woman's voice. Even as I said it out loud, it sounded unbelievable, but I knew what I had experienced. I had been fully awake by the time I heard the voice, and the memory of it was vivid and terrifying. Eventually, our exhaustion overtook the fear, and we managed to get some sleep, though it was restless and uneasy. The next morning, the incident still felt unreal, but the fear lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something deeply unsettling had happened, something that I couldn't easily explain away. Later that day, I spoke to my uncle about it. I told him exactly what had happened and asked him directly why the house was considered haunted. He laughed lightly at first, not in a mocking way, but as if he had heard similar stories before. He suggested that I had probably encountered the ghost of someone who used to stay in the guest house back when it was still operating. His casual tone didn't make me feel any better, so I pressed him for a proper explanation. That was when he told me about a tragic event that had occurred in the area during the early 1900s. There had been a terrible boating accident off the coast of Cornwall. A small passenger vessel had set out on a trip and never returned. The boat disappeared entirely, along with something like 30 passengers on board. No survivors were found, and the incident had become one of those lingering local tragedies, passed down through generations. What made the story even more unsettling was the connection to the house. A large number of the passengers who vanished on that boat had been staying at the guest house before their ill-fated journey. According to local belief, they were presumed dead, and ever since then, people in the area had assumed that the spirits of those lost passengers haunted the place where they had last stayed. Hearing this explanation sent a chill through me. The woman's question echoed in my mind. "Are you going to come tomorrow?" In light of what my uncle had told me, it seemed horrifyingly plausible that the voice I had heard belonged to one of those passengers, someone who had been asking whether I was going to join them on the boat the next day, unaware of the disaster that awaited. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that stress, darkness, and imagination could explain what I experienced. But the physical sensations, the timing, and the clarity of the voice made it hard to dismiss. I hadn't just heard something. I had felt it. For the rest of that trip, I stayed far away from the water. Boats, even small ones, made me uneasy. The sea, which had once felt calming and beautiful, now carried an undercurrent of menace. Every time I passed the house's long corridors or stood near the staircase, I found myself listening for footsteps that weren't there. Years have passed since that summer, but the memory has never faded. I don't claim to know exactly what happened that night, or whether it was truly something supernatural. All I know is that in that old house on the Cornish coast, in the quiet darkness of the early hours, I experienced something that still defies explanation. And no matter how much time goes by, part of me will always remember that voice in the dark, calmly asking a question that, in hindsight, feels far more ominous than it did in the moment. I work part-time at an air museum, mostly because I genuinely enjoy it rather than for the money. It is the kind of job you take because you love history, aviation, and the feeling of being surrounded by stories that mattered to people long before you arrived. The museum itself is filled with historical artifacts that carry a lot of emotional weight. There are aircraft that have seen real combat, planes flown by people whose names are still spoken with respect, uniforms that once belonged to pilots who never made it home, and personal items that were once deeply important to someone's everyday life. Some of these objects look ordinary at first glance, but when you know their stories, it becomes impossible not to feel something standing near them. Over the years, the museum has also been used as an event center. We host weddings, our fundraisers, celebrations of life, and funerals. This is especially common for pilots. There is a long-standing belief connected to the airfield that famous pilots do not live long lives. Around the museum, we half-jokingly, half-seriously refer to this as the Klingensmith curse. It is named after a well-known female pilot who died in a racing crash decades ago and was reportedly treated terribly by her male colleagues both before and after her death. Her story is often brought up as a reminder of how harsh and unfair the aviation world could be, especially to women, and how much bitterness and tragedy seem to cling to the place. In the last 10 years alone, 5 pilots have been killed in air crashes connected to the airfield. Each time, the museum hosted their funerals or memorial services. In several cases, their aircraft are still on display, sitting quietly in the hangar, as if waiting for their owners to return. Because of this, many people believe there is a lot of heavy or negative energy surrounding the museum. Despite that, it is not a depressing place. During the day, it feels lively and welcoming. Families visit, children stare up at the planes in awe, and volunteers enthusiastically tell stories about aviation history. It is a strange balance, a place that feels both joyful and somber at the same time. My boss has worked at the museum for years and has experienced things that she cannot easily explain. She often talks about hearing voices when she knows she is the only person in the building. Sometimes she will hear what sounds like casual conversation or someone calling out, only to find empty rooms and silent hallways. There are a few lights around the museum that turn on by themselves for no apparent reason, even after the building has been locked up for the night. Objects occasionally seem to move slightly, as if someone has been working nearby. Tools or small items will be found in different places than where they were left. More than one employee has mentioned seeing shadowy figures, darting between planes or slipping past exhibits out of the corner of their eye. The shared belief among staff is that it feels as though ground crews or pilots are still working on the aircraft, going about their routines long after their physical lives ended. I had heard all of these stories before my own experience, But like many people, I treated them with a certain level of skepticism. I believed my co-workers were honest about what they experienced, but I had never personally seen or heard anything unusual. To me, the museum was simply an old building full of meaningful objects and memories. I respected the atmosphere, but I did not feel afraid of it. That changed one night when I was helping clean up after an event. We had hosted a gathering earlier in the evening, and once it ended, staff stayed behind to put everything back in order. This included cleaning the bathrooms at the back of the hangar, far from the main entrance and offices. I gathered my cleaning supplies and headed to the other side of the building. At that point, there were only 3 people left inside: me, the event coordinator, and an older male employee who had worked there for years. The hangar was mostly dark except for a few lights that remained on for cleaning. The size of the space always feels more noticeable at night. Sounds echo differently, and even your own footsteps seem louder than usual. I went into the back bathroom and began cleaning, focused on getting the job done so we could all head home. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but that was not unusual after hours. While I was cleaning, I suddenly heard my name called out loud and clear. The voice said, "Jamak, can you come here?" It was not distant or muffled. It sounded close, as if the person were standing just outside the bathroom. The voice belonged to an older man, probably in his mid-60s. There was nothing strange or threatening about the tone. It sounded completely normal, like a coworker needing help with something. Without thinking much about it, I put down my cleaning supplies and walked out of the bathroom to see what was needed. As soon as I stepped into the hangar, I realized something was wrong. There was no one there. The open space in front of me was completely empty. Given the size of the hangar and the lighting, I should have been able to see anyone standing nearby. There was nowhere someone could have gone in the few seconds it took me to exit the bathroom. My first thought was that the older male employee was playing a joke on me. That seemed like the most logical explanation. Assuming that, I walked across the hangar to find him and ask what he needed. When I reached him, I casually asked what was up and why he had called me over. He looked genuinely confused and told me straight out that he had not called my name. He did not look like someone trying to mess with me. At that moment, the event coordinator joined the conversation and confirmed that neither of them had called out. She explained that they had both been outside helping guide the band out of the parking lot and had only just come back inside. The realization hit me immediately. I felt a cold wave of unease wash over me as I turned and looked back toward the bathrooms I had just left. As I did, I saw something that I will never forget. A dark shadow, shaped like a person but without any clear features, ran into the bathroom. At the exact same moment, the lights on that entire side of the hangar shut off. The darkness was complete and sudden, and it lasted for a solid 10 seconds. Those 10 seconds felt much longer. My heart was racing, and I felt frozen in place. No one spoke. The hangar was silent except for the faint hum of distant equipment. When the lights came back on, everything looked normal again. The bathroom door was open, and there was no sign that anyone or anything had been there. The older employee and the event coordinator both noticed how shaken I was. I tried to explain what I had seen, though the words felt inadequate. They did not laugh or dismiss me. Instead, they exchanged looks that suggested this was not entirely new to them. They both admitted that strange things happened in the museum, especially late at night, and that hearing voices was something others had experienced before. From that moment on, my perspective changed completely. I no longer felt like the stories were just exaggerations or coincidences. I had heard my name called clearly by a voice that did not belong to anyone present. I had seen a shadow move with purpose, not just a trick of the light. The sudden blackout felt deliberate, as if something wanted to make its presence known. To this day, I stand by what I experienced. I have no doubt in my mind that the museum is haunted. It does not feel hostile or malicious, but it feels occupied. It feels like a place where the past has not fully let go, where the spirits of pilots, ground crew, and those connected to the airfield still linger. Sometimes it feels as though they are simply continuing their routines, unaware that time has moved on without them. Working there now carries a different weight. I still enjoy the job and the sense of history, but I am far more aware of the unseen presence that seems to share the space. Every time I hear a noise or catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, I remember that night. The museum may be a happy place filled with celebration and remembrance, but it is also a place where the past feels very much alive, watching, listening, and occasionally calling your name. I work as a first responder, which means death is never far away from my day-to-day life. It is something you learn to live with, even if you never truly get used to it. You see people on what might be the worst day of their lives, sometimes the last day of their lives, and you learn how to stay calm, focused, and professional, no matter how heavy the situation feels. Over time, you build a certain emotional armor just to survive the job. Because of that, people often assume that first responders are constantly surrounded by ghosts or paranormal experiences. The truth is, at least for me, that has not really been the case. I have not had many ghost encounters on the job at all. What happened on this particular call, though, does not feel like a typical ghost story. Even now, years later, I still think of it as something more spiritual. Something that sits in a gray area between life and death. On the day it happened, I was working overtime on a crew that was not my usual one. Anyone who works emergency services knows how different that can feel. Even though everyone is trained and competent, there is a certain rhythm and unspoken understanding that comes with your regular crew. When you are placed with a different group, everything feels slightly off, not in a bad way, just unfamiliar. That day had already been long and exhausting, the kind of shift where you are counting the hours until you can finally go home and sleep. The call came in for a very bad motor vehicle accident. From the initial information we received, it was clear this was not going to be a minor incident. Our dispatch advised that a truck carrying multiple occupants had been hit head-on by a large crane truck. Anyone with experience knows that crane trucks are massive, heavy, and unforgiving. A head-on collision involving one of those almost never ends well. As we responded, the atmosphere in the rig shifted immediately. Conversation stopped, and everyone focused on mentally preparing for what we were about to walk into. When we arrived on scene, the reality was even worse than expected. The wreckage was severe. The truck was destroyed, metal twisted and crushed in ways that made it hard to imagine anyone surviving inside. There were multiple victims, and the scene was chaotic in the way that only major accidents can be. Bystanders stood at a distance, some crying, some in shock, others trying to help but not knowing how. The smell of fuel, hot metal, and summer heat hung thick in the air. We quickly established command and began triaging patients. There were multiple fatalities at the scene. One of the victims was a young kid, younger than anyone should ever have to be in a situation like that. He had been trapped inside the vehicle, and we had to extricate him. Anyone who has ever worked in extrication knows how physically and emotionally demanding it is, especially when the patient is a child. We worked methodically, doing everything by the book, cutting and prying metal away piece by piece to reach him. Once we got him out, we immediately began CPR. Even though the injuries were severe and the odds were not in our favor, you do not stop fighting for a life just because the situation looks grim. We worked him hard, cycling compressions, airway management, and everything else we could do in the field. Time seemed to blur together, seconds stretching into minutes. Despite our efforts, it became clear that there was nothing more we could do. He did not respond, and he was pronounced dead on scene. That moment never gets easier, no matter how many times you experience it. There is a heaviness that settles over everyone involved. You do your best to compartmentalize it, to focus on the next task, because there is always more to be done. In this case, the scene was still active. 3 other patients were being transported by ground ambulance, and 1 was flown out by air ambulance. The sound of the helicopter overhead mixed with the distant wail of sirens created an eerie backdrop. Once the transports were complete, and things began to slow down, we were left waiting for the coroner to arrive for the young kid who did not make it. We had placed a sheet over him, as is standard practice, to provide some dignity and privacy. The scene was quieter now, but the weight of what had happened was still heavy in the air. The sun was high, and it was a brutally warm summer day. The heat was intense, and there was absolutely no air movement. Not a hint of a breeze. The air felt thick and still, like the world itself was holding its breath. Myself and the rest of the crew stood nearby, talking quietly, checking equipment, and mentally decompressing from the chaos we had just been through. No one was joking or being loud. It was one of those moments where everyone is lost in their own thoughts, replaying parts of the call in their head, wondering if there was anything else that could have been done. That is when something happened that I will never forget. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement near where the young kid was lying. At first, I thought it might just be my imagination or the heat playing tricks on me. Then I heard one of the other crew members say something like, "Are you seeing that?" We all turned and looked at the same time. The sheet that had been placed over the kid began to lift up. Not flutter, not ripple, but slowly rise several inches into the air, as if something beneath it was pushing upward. It was deliberate and smooth, not sudden or chaotic. It looked exactly like the way a sheet would move if someone underneath took a deep breath and their chest expanded. For a brief moment, it almost looked like air was escaping from his body. Then, just as calmly as it had risen, the sheet settled back down onto him. The entire crew stood there in stunned silence. No one spoke right away. We all knew what we had seen. There was no wind. There was no helicopter wash at that moment. No vehicles passed by close enough to cause air movement. The heat was oppressive, but it was a still dead kind of heat. There was absolutely no environmental explanation for what we had just witnessed. I remember feeling a strange mix of emotions all at once. There was shock, of course, but also something else, something difficult to put into words. It did not feel scary in the traditional sense. It felt solemn, almost sacred. The scene, which had already been heavy, suddenly felt profoundly quiet, as if something important had just occurred. Someone finally broke the silence, I quietly asking if anyone could explain what we had just seen. No one could. A few people tried to rationalize it, mentioning residual air in the lungs or gases escaping the body. Those explanations did not sit right with any of us, especially given the way the sheet moved and the timing of it. We had all been on scenes before. We had all seen post-mortem changes. This was different. To this day, every single person who was there agrees on one thing. We all believe we witnessed something leaving that body. Whether you want to call it a soul, a spirit, or something else, entirely depends on your personal beliefs. I am not someone who jumps to supernatural conclusions easily, especially given my line of work. I am used to relying on science, protocols, and observable facts. But there are moments that defy easy explanation, moments that force you to accept that there may be more to life and death than we fully understand. That experience stayed with me long after the scene was cleared and the coroner arrived. I carried it with me through the rest of that shift and into many shifts afterward. It changed the way I thought about death, not in a dramatic or religious way, but in a quieter, more reflective sense. It made me consider that maybe death is not just an abrupt ending, but a transition, something that happens gently, even when the circumstances leading up to it are violent and tragic. I have been on countless calls since then. I have seen more death, more loss, and more heartbreak than I ever imagined I would when I first chose this career. I have not seen anything quite like that again. That moment stands alone in my memory, clear and vivid, untouched by time. Whenever people ask me if I believe in ghosts or spirits, I usually hesitate before answering. I do not know if what we saw that day fits neatly into any category. I just know that on a scorching summer afternoon, standing on the side of a road surrounded by wreckage and grief, a group of seasoned first responders witnessed something none of us could explain. And deep down, all of us felt the same thing in that moment. It felt like a soul saying goodbye. No matter how much experience you have, no matter how tough you think you are, moments like that remind you that life is fragile and mysterious. They remind you that even in a job defined by chaos and tragedy, there can still be moments of profound meaning. That day, amid sirens, broken metal, and unbearable loss, I believe we witnessed something sacred, and that is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I do not work in healthcare myself, but my mom does, and several other relatives in my family do as well. Growing up, medicine and hospitals were always part of the background of our lives. Dinner table conversations often drifted toward long shifts, difficult patients, and things they had seen that most people never experience. What always stood out to me, though, was how grounded and skeptical most of them were. With the exception of my mom, the other doctors and healthcare workers in my family were very practical people. They believed in evidence and in logic and in things that could be measured or explained. They were not the type to jump to supernatural conclusions or exaggerate strange experiences. That is part of why what happened in our family has stayed with me for so long. My grandfather passed away in the 1990s after a long battle with cancer and black lung disease. He had worked hard his entire life, and his health had slowly declined over the years. By the time he was hospitalized near the end, the family had already begun preparing themselves for the inevitable, even though no amount of preparation ever truly makes a loss easier. When he finally passed, it happened in the hospital, surrounded by people who loved him. What happened immediately after his death is something my family still talks about, even decades later. Nearly everyone who was present that day, including doctors and nurses in our own family, swore that they saw my grandfather walking down the hallway shortly after he died. They all described the same thing. He was not wearing a hospital gown. He was dressed in his usual clothes, the kind of outfit he wore almost every day, clothes that were so familiar they were practically part of his identity. He looked healthy, upright, and calm. He walked down the hallway and turned a corner just as if he were leaving like he had done 100 times before. At first, some of them thought they were imagining things, overwhelmed by grief and exhaustion. But then they realized they were not alone in seeing it. Person after person quietly admitted that they had seen him too. The only one who reacted differently was my uncle. Instead of standing there in shock, he followed him. He moved quickly, rounding the corner in time to see the elevator doors closing. The elevator was directly across from the nurse's station, so he walked over and asked if anyone had just gotten on. The nurses looked at him with mild confusion and said they had not seen anyone enter the elevator. When he explained that he thought a man had just walked in as the doors were closing, they smiled sympathetically and laughed a little. They told him, gently and almost kindly, that the elevators in that hospital were old and unreliable. According to them, the doors would sometimes open and close on their own for no apparent reason. They assured him that it happened all the time. My uncle did not push the issue. He just nodded and walked away. But he never forgot what he saw. None of them did. What made it even more unsettling was that these were not dramatic or emotional people. These were individuals trained to remain calm, trained to look for rational explanations, and trained to question their own perceptions. And yet, nearly all of them shared the same experience. After that day, the encounters did not stop. In fact, they continued for the next 20 years. The most common thing people noticed was smell. My mom's house, in particular, would sometimes suddenly fill with an overwhelming scent of cigarette smoke. It was not faint or subtle. It was strong, unmistakable, and impossible to ignore. The strange part was that no one in our household smoked. There were only 3 of us living there, and none of us had ever been smokers. We also lived in a very remote area, far away from neighbors, with no nearby houses that could have explained the smell drifting in from outside. My grandfather, on the other hand, had been a lifelong smoker. Cigarettes were part of who he was, part of his routine, part of his presence. When the smell appeared, it always felt familiar rather than threatening. There was never any sense of fear associated with it. It felt more like he was stopping by, checking in, lingering the way he always had when he was alive. Other family members experienced similar things, though not always with cigarette smoke. Some would suddenly smell baking bread, rich and warm, filling a room out of nowhere. Others would smell celery, fennel, and other spices my grandfather used when he made sausage. He was known in the family for his cooking, especially his homemade sausage and wine. A few relatives even reported smelling the deep, earthy scent of wine and the damp, cool smell of the cellar where he used to make it. Each of these scents was tied directly to him, to things he loved and took pride in during his life. There was never any logical explanation. The smells would appear suddenly and then fade just as quickly. No food was cooking. No one nearby was smoking. No old containers were being opened. It was as if the memories themselves had briefly become real. One of the most unusual and compelling parts of these experiences involved my cousin when he was very young. He was just a small child at the time, too young to understand family history, or to have been told detailed stories about relatives who had passed away. He would casually mention that my grandfather came to visit him. He talked about it the way children talk about everyday things, without fear or drama. According to him, my grandfather would stop by, talk to him, and sometimes bring other people along. What made this deeply unsettling was that some of the people my cousin described were family members who had died long before any of us were born. One in particular stood out. He talked about a great-uncle who had been killed at sea during World War II. This relative had died young and had been buried at sea, so there was never a grave to visit, never a proper goodbye. My cousin knew details about this uncle that only the older members of the family could verify. He knew that the man had played guitar in Chicago. He knew about his personality, about how funny he was, about the way he made people laugh. At first, the adults brushed it off as imagination. Children have vivid imaginations, after all. But then the details became too specific to ignore. My cousin had no way of knowing these things. No one had told him. These were not stories that were shared often, especially not with a child. And yet he spoke about this uncle as if he knew him personally. There were moments when we would find my cousin laughing uncontrollably by himself. When asked what was so funny, he would simply say that his uncle was being silly. He would mention the uncle's name, the same one the family remembered as being the funniest of them all. According to older relatives, this uncle had a sense of humor that stood out even in a family full of funny people. His death had devastated everyone, especially because they never got the chance to properly say goodbye. Years later, while cleaning out my grandmother's house, I came across a wooden guitar tucked away among old belongings. When I looked into it, I discovered that it had been manufactured in Chicago. That detail sent a chill through me. It matched exactly what my cousin had said years earlier, long before anyone found that guitar. It felt like a quiet confirmation of something none of us could fully explain. For years, these experiences continued. They were never frightening. If anything, they felt comforting, like my grandfather was still watching over the family, still present in some way. People found reassurance in the idea that he had not simply vanished, that the bond had not been completely severed by death. Then, in 2018, my grandmother passed away. She and my grandfather had been married since they were teenagers. They had built a life together that spanned decades, weathered hardship, raised a family, and grown old side by side. After my grandfather died, many of us felt that he stayed behind for her, that he lingered because he could not bear to leave her alone. That idea brought comfort to a lot of people. After my grandmother's death, something changed. All of the encounters with my grandfather stopped. The cigarette smell never returned. The sense of food and wine disappeared. No one reported seeing or hearing anything unusual. My cousin stopped talking about visits. It was as if a door had quietly closed. For some family members, that was incredibly sad. They had found comfort in believing he was still around, still close. Losing that presence felt like losing him all over again. It felt final in a way that his death alone had not. At the same time, there was another way to look at it. Many of us found peace in the thought that he had finally moved on, that he had been waiting for my grandmother and could now leave with her. The idea that they were together again, wherever that might be, was far more comforting than the thought of him lingering alone. Since 2018, there have been no more unexplained stories, no strange smells, no sightings, no quiet moments that made people pause and wonder. In a way, it feels like we truly lost everyone back then. The house, the family gatherings, and even the memories feel quieter now. But there is also a deep sense of comfort in knowing that whatever was holding them here is no longer necessary. They lived their lives, loved each other fiercely, and left together. Whether you believe these experiences were spiritual, psychological, or something else entirely, they left a lasting impact on our family. For a group of people who pride themselves on skepticism and logic, these moments challenge what they thought they knew about life and death. They did not turn anyone into believers overnight, but they did open a door to the possibility that love does not end as neatly as we like to think. And maybe that is the most comforting part of all. Sorry to interrupt for just a moment. If you're new here, consider subscribing to Midnight Whispers for daily true horror stories that stay with you long after they're told, quietly unsettling and meant for the late hours. You can also turn on notifications so you're always here when a new story arrives and the night begins to stir again. Now, let's continue. This is a story I have only ever shared with a handful of people, partly because it feels so personal and partly because I know how unbelievable it might sound to anyone who has not experienced something similar. Even now, years later, it remains the strangest and most defining experience of my life. I am a funeral celebrant by profession, currently training to also become a family celebrant so that I can officiate weddings as well as funerals. Death, grief, and remembrance are things I work with regularly. But this story is not about my work. It is about my own mother, and about a moment that changed how I understand life, death, and everything in between. My mom had cancer. It was not a sudden diagnosis, and it was not an easy journey. Like many families who go through this, we lived for months in a strange in-between state, where hope and dread coexist every day. You cling to small improvements, good test results, or a decent day where pain seems manageable, while at the same time knowing, deep down, that you are moving toward an ending you cannot stop. By September 2020, it became clear that the end was very close. I received a call telling me I needed to come home immediately because she was dying. When I arrived, the atmosphere in the house was heavy in a way that is hard to describe unless you have lived it. Time felt distorted. Everything moved slowly and too fast at the same time. We knew what was coming, but knowing did nothing to soften it. From the moment I got home, we made a collective decision that she would not be left alone for even a second. Someone was always with her, sitting beside the bed, holding her hand, talking to her, or simply being present in silence. There was a quiet understanding among us that this was sacred time, time we would never get back. As the night wore on, exhaustion set in. Grief is tiring in a very physical way, and so is vigilance. You are constantly watching, listening, checking breathing, checking comfort, checking for signs that the moment might be approaching. At around 1 a.m, my dad gently told me to go and lie down for a bit. He said he would sit with her, that I needed some rest, even if it was only for a short while. I didn't want to go. Every instinct in me resisted the idea of leaving her, even to sleep in the same house. But he insisted, and eventually I agreed, telling myself I would only rest briefly. I went to my bedroom and lay down on my bed, fully clothed, not really expecting to sleep deeply. The house was quiet in that particular way it gets in the early hours of the morning, when the world feels paused. I remember staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the house, and thinking about how strange it felt to be lying down while my mom was dying just below me. Her bed was directly beneath mine. In fact, the layout of the house meant that I was almost exactly over her. That thought stayed with me even as I began to drift in and out of a light, restless sleep. A few hours later, something happened that I still struggle to put into words. I was jolted awake by an absolutely horrific sensation ripping through my body. The pain was centered in my torso, my chest, and my lungs. It was unlike anything I had ever felt before. It was not a sharp pain and not a dull ache. It felt like suffocating and drowning at the same time, as if all the air had been forcibly removed from my body. There was an overwhelming sense of pressure and panic, but not emotional panic. It was physical, primal, and terrifying. I could not move. My body felt frozen, locked in place by the intensity of the sensation. It felt as though my lungs simply refused to work, as though I was desperately trying to breathe but could not get any oxygen in. I remember thinking very clearly that I was dying. The thought was not dramatic or emotional. It was strangely calm, almost observational, as if my mind was registering a fact rather than reacting to a fear. The sensation did not last very long, maybe only seconds. But in that moment, it felt endless. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. My body released. I could breathe again. The pain vanished as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a deep sense of shock and confusion. I lay there, staring into the darkness, trying to understand what had just happened. My heart was racing, but I was no longer in pain. I did not feel sick afterward. There was no lingering discomfort, no soreness, no tightness. It was as if nothing had happened at all, except I knew it had. Only a few minutes later, there was a knock at my bedroom door. My dad came in quietly and told me that my mom had died. The timing was so precise that it took my breath away all over again. I did not need to ask when it happened. I knew. Something in me knew with absolute certainty that the moment I experienced that pain was the moment she died. Standing there in my room, hearing my dad say the words out loud, I felt a strange sense of confirmation rather than surprise. It felt like two pieces of a puzzle snapping together in a way that was both devastating and deeply unsettling. In the days and weeks that followed, I replayed that moment over and over in my mind. I am not a person who jumps to dramatic conclusions easily. I have always considered myself thoughtful and grounded. But the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that I had experienced my mother's final moments in some way. She had cancer, but the actual cause of her death was pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs and a lack of oxygen. What I felt was exactly that: suffocation, drowning, the inability to breathe. The physical alignment of it all only made it harder to dismiss. My bed was directly above hers. I was almost directly over her body as she died. The house was quiet. There were no external triggers, no noises, no alarms, no phone calls. And yet my body reacted with overwhelming intensity at precisely the moment she passed. I know how this sounds. I know that to many people it might seem like coincidence, imagination, or the result of extreme emotional stress. I have asked myself those same questions many times. I have wondered if it could have been a panic attack or some strange physiological response to grief. I have wondered if it could have been heartburn, anxiety, or some kind of psychosomatic reaction brought on by exhaustion and fear. But here is the thing. I have had panic attacks before. I know what they feel like. I have had heartburn before. I know that sensation too. This was different. Completely different. Panic attacks are terrifying, but they have a certain pattern to them. They build, they peak, they fade. There is usually an emotional component, racing thoughts, fear spiraling. This had none of that. It was sudden, silent, and purely physical. There was no buildup and no lingering after effect. Just an intense, suffocating pain, and then nothing. Heartburn is uncomfortable, sometimes painful, but it does not make you feel like you are drowning. It does not paralyze your body or make breathing feel impossible. What I experienced felt far more specific, far more targeted, and far more profound than anything I had felt before or since. I've also spoken to many people since then who have shared eerily similar stories. People who felt a sudden pain, a sudden shift, or an overwhelming sensation at the exact moment a loved one died, even when they were not in the same room. These stories are not rare, but they are rarely talked about openly. Many people are afraid of being dismissed, ridiculed, or told they are imagining things. Grief already makes you feel vulnerable. Adding something that sounds inexplicable on top of that can feel like too much. I have often thought about why this happened to me, if that is even the right question. My relationship with my mom was deep and complex, like most mother-child relationships are. There was love, history, shared pain, shared a joy, and a bond that had been built over a lifetime. Maybe that connection mattered. Maybe proximity mattered. Or maybe none of that matters at all, and this was simply the way her passing manifested in my body for reasons I will never fully understand. What I do know is that the experience fundamentally changed me. Before my mom died, I had already been working as a funeral celebrant, but my beliefs about death were not fully formed. I approached it with respect and compassion, but also with a certain emotional distance. I understood grief intellectually. I knew how to hold space for it. But after that night, something shifted. That experience became one of the reasons I fully committed to this path. It deepened my belief that there is more to life than our physical bodies. Call it souls, spirit, energy, consciousness, an animating force, or whatever term feels right. I do not pretend to know exactly what it is, but I am completely convinced that something continues, something returns to the universe, something moves on. In the midst of unimaginable grief, that realization was a gift. It did not take the pain away. It did not make losing my mom easier, but it gave the loss a different shape. It allowed me to believe that her death was not just an ending, but a transition. That belief has stayed with me and informs the way I work with families now, the way I speak about death, and the way I hold space for others who are grieving. When I stand with people during funerals, when I help them say goodbye, I am not just performing a role. I am drawing from something deeply personal. I know in my bones that death is not just a biological event. It is something that ripples outward, touching the people who are connected to the one who is leaving. Sometimes those ripples are emotional. Sometimes they are physical. Sometimes they are something else entirely. I am fully aware that science does not have an explanation for what I experienced, and that is okay. Not everything meaningful fits neatly into a scientific framework. I am also open to the idea that there may one day be an explanation that we do not yet understand. I do not feel the need to prove what happened to anyone else. I only know what it felt like when it happened, and how profoundly it changed me. Even now, writing this, I can still remember that sensation with unsettling clarity. I remember the darkness of the room, the sudden inability to breathe, and the way my body reacted before my mind had time to catch up. I remember the knock on the door and my dad's voice. Those moments are etched into me in a way that time has not dulled. I do not expect everyone to believe this story. I do not need them to. I am not trying to convince anyone of anything. I am simply sharing something that is true to my experience, something that shaped my understanding of life and death in a profound way. Losing my mom was the hardest thing I've ever been through. But within that loss, there was also a strange and unexpected lesson. There is more to us than flesh and bone. There is connection, energy, and something that transcends the moment our bodies stop working. That belief does not erase grief, but it does soften its sharpest edges. In the end, that night taught me something important. Even in death, even in pain, there can be meaning. And sometimes the most extraordinary truths are learned in the moments when we are at our most broken. When I was a kid, probably around 8 or 9 years old, I had an experience that still stands out as one of the strangest things that has ever happened to me. I did not grow up in a household where people talked about ghosts or paranormal stuff, and I was not the kind of child who scared easily or imagined monsters in the dark. That is part of what makes this memory stick with me so strongly. It did not feel like imagination. It felt physical, loud, and undeniable. At the time, I shared a house with my parents and my older brother. Like most siblings, my brother loved messing with me whenever he could. Pranks, teasing, jump scares, all of that was normal, so whenever something weird happened, My first assumption was always that he was behind it. That assumption carried me through the first part of this experience, too. One night, while I was asleep in my bed, I was jolted awake by a sound that made absolutely no sense. I heard the unmistakable whine of a small electric motor and the buzzing sound of plastic wheels moving fast across the floor. Before I even opened my eyes, my brain registered exactly what it was. It was my RC toy car. I had played with it hundreds of times. I knew that sound like muscle memory. I opened my eyes and lay there listening as the car zipped back and forth across my bedroom floor. It was not just moving a little. It was going fast, changing direction, bumping into things the way it would if someone was actively controlling it. Half asleep and annoyed, I immediately assumed my brother was pulling some kind of joke. Maybe he had sneaked the remote into my room and was hiding somewhere, trying to scare me. I yelled his name and told him to knock it off. The car stopped. A second later, I heard my brother's voice from his room, sounding groggy and irritated, asking what I was yelling about. That threw me off a little, but I still assumed he was lying. Older brothers lie. That is what they do. The next morning, I confronted him properly. I asked him why he had been messing with my RC car in the middle of the night. He looked genuinely confused and swore up and down that he had not touched it. He said he had been asleep the whole time and that I probably dreamed it. I did not fully believe him, but I let it go. Kids accept weird explanations more easily than adults do. Still, something about it bothered me. The car had been in my room, but I could not remember leaving the remote anywhere obvious. So that day, I decided to make sure it could not happen again. I took the remote and hid it somewhere I was sure no one would find it. My parents were remodeling part of the house at the time, and there was an unfinished room with insulation exposed. I pushed the remote way back behind the insulation, in a place that would have been uncomfortable and inconvenient for anyone else to reach. I did not tell anyone where it was. That night, I went to bed feeling pretty confident. Even if my brother had been lying, there was no way he could control the car without the remote. I remember feeling a little proud of myself, like I had outsmarted him. At almost the exact same time as the night before, I heard it again. The buzzing motor, the wheels scraping against the floor. The RC car started racing back and forth across my bedroom like it was possessed. This time it was even more aggressive. It slammed into the walls. It ran straight into my bedroom door over and over again, thudding loudly, like it was trying to get out. My heart was pounding, but my mind was still clinging to logic. I was absolutely convinced it had to be my brother. There was no other explanation that made sense to me at that age. Furious and scared, I jumped out of bed and flung the door open, fully expecting to catch him standing there with the remote. There was no one there. The hallway was empty. The house was quiet. I immediately ran to my brother's room and pushed his door open. He was fast asleep in his bed, snoring lightly, completely unaware of what was happening. He did not stir at all. That alone sent a chill through me, but what I saw next really pushed me over the edge. The RC car was no longer in my room. I followed the sound and found it in the unfinished room where I had hidden the remote. The car was sitting in the middle of the floor, idling. The motor was running, the wheels twitching slightly, like it was waiting for another command. The remote was still exactly where I had hidden it, buried behind the insulation. At that point, I was genuinely terrified. I stood there staring at the car, my stomach tight, my skin prickling. I did not know what to do. I did not touch it. Eventually, I backed away, went back to my room, and pulled the covers over my head like that would somehow protect me. I did not sleep much that night. The next day, I told my parents what had happened. They did what parents usually do in situations like that. They reassured me, told me there had to be a reasonable explanation, and suggested maybe the batteries were low or something was malfunctioning. That explanation did not sit right with me, but I desperately wanted to believe it. That afternoon, I decided to end the whole thing once and for all. I took the batteries out of the remote. Then I took the batteries out of the car itself. I tested it multiple times, pressing buttons, flicking switches, doing everything I could to make sure there was absolutely no power left in either device. The car did nothing. Completely dead. I felt a huge wave of relief. To be extra careful, I hid the remote again, this time even farther away. I put it in the shed out back, somewhere no one would casually go at night. Then I went to bed, convinced the problem was finally solved. I was wrong. That night, almost at the same time as the previous 2 nights, I heard it again. The car came to life. The sound was unmistakable. The motor whined. The wheels spun. The car raced around my bedroom like nothing had changed. No batteries, no remote, no logical explanation. I remember sitting straight up in bed, frozen, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. At 8 or 9 years old, there is a point where fear turns into something else. Not bravery exactly, but a kind of desperate, instinctive response. I was done being scared. I was done trying to understand. I wanted it to stop. So I got out of bed, grabbed the car, and smashed the absolute hell out of it. I slammed it against the floor. I stomped on it. I hit it until pieces cracked and broke off, and the motor finally went silent. I do not remember crying. I do not remember yelling. I just remember needing it to be destroyed, like that was the only way to make sure it could not come back to life again. After that, nothing else happened. No more noises. No more movement. The room went quiet in a way that felt final. In the morning, my parents were not thrilled to see the destroyed toy, but I did not care. I never told them the full intensity of that third night. I do not think I even had the words to explain it properly back then. To this day, I have never had another experience like that. I have tried, as an adult, to rationalize it. Electrical faults, residual charge, faulty wiring, imagination, sleep-related hallucinations. None of those explanations fully account for all the details, especially the lack of batteries and the car moving rooms. What stays with me most is not just the fear, but the certainty I felt in those moments. The sound was real. The movement was real. I was awake. And whatever caused it, it did not care about logic or explanations. I do not know if it was paranormal. I do not know if it was some rare mechanical fluke combined with a child's fear. All I know is that something happened in that room over 3 nights that I still cannot explain. An 8-year-old me responded in the most sensible way he could think of at the time. He made sure the damn thing could never move again. If you're still here, then these stories didn't simply fade away. They settled in. Every story you heard tonight came from real moments, real people, and real situations where something felt off or nearly went wrong. If you want to keep exploring stories that linger in your thoughts long after the night grows quiet, consider subscribing to Midnight Whispers. There are more stories waiting in the dark, and not all of them let you leave in time.